Florida Senator and Republican presidential candidate Marco Rubio spoke today about national security and foreign affairs at an event hosted by the Foreign Policy Initiative in New York City. Topics included the Iran nuclear agreement and U.S. relations with Cuba. This comes as part of C-SPAN's Road to the White House coverage. It's 50 minutes.
Hi, good morning. Good morning. My name's Chris Griffin. I am the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. On behalf of the entire team at FPI, it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to our event, Restoring American Leadership, a conversation with Senator Marco Rubio. Ask you at this time to please make sure that your cell phones are turned off or muted so we can get our event started. The Foreign Policy Initiative was established in 2009 as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization committed to educating policymakers, opinion leaders, and the public about the importance of continued American engagement and leadership in world affairs, the importance of standing up for our democratic allies, standing up against rogue regimes that threaten them, promoting human rights for those who are oppressed by their governments, and maintaining a strong defense and open economy. It's an honor to be joined this morning by Senator Rubio for a conversation about these ideas and how to effectively promote them. Before we get started, I want to take a moment and thank the many members of our leadership network from FPI. These are the alumni. Here. These are the alumni of our professional development programs in Washington, D.C. and New York. If you'd like to learn more about FPI after today's event, I invite you to please chat with me, any member of that network, any member of our staff, and point out that we have coming up on October 1 in Washington, D.C. at the museum. Our forum we will be continuing this type of conversation with other national security leaders. Senator Marco Rubio is, of course, well known to this audience. Elected in 2010 to represent the state of Florida in the U.S. Senate. His duties in that body include service on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and the Select Committee on Intelligence. He is chairman of the subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Before his election to the Senate, he served the state of Florida and its House of Representatives, and from 2005 to 2009 was the Speaker of that body. After Senator Rubio's prepared remarks, he'll be joined on stage by Kathleen Troya McFarland, known to all those fortunate enough to call her a friend as KT. She'll hold a conversation with the Senator before moderating your questions for him. You should find on your tables index cards and pens. We'll ask as we look forward to that portion of the conversation that you write any questions that you may have on those index cards. If you could be kind enough to just put a one-word or two-word topic at the top of them to make sure that we can get those sorted and get through those as efficiently as possible. Ms. McFarland is Fox News national security analyst. She is here. She's also the anchor of DEFCON 3 on foxnews.com. Her service in government spanned across 3 administrations, and she was awarded the Defense Department's highest civilian award for her service in the Reagan administration. I thank KT for serving as our moderator today and ask all of you to please join me in welcoming Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here at the Foreign Policy Initiative again. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today, because as we gather here today, there are 2 historic events that are in progress. The first is the arrival of Secretary of State John Kerry in Cuba. And the second is President Obama's continued campaign to secure congressional approval for his deal with Iran. While numerous crises around the globe will require the attention of America's next president, I'd like to focus my remarks today on these 2 dangerous developments with Iran and Cuba, because I believe they represent the convergence of nearly every flawed strategic, moral, and economic notion that has driven President Obama's foreign policy, and as such, are emblematic of so many of the crises that have worsened around the world during his time in office. These deals demonstrate with jarring clarity how this administration has failed to anticipate impending crisis, ignored the realities of the globalized economy, and sought to make America liked rather than respected. The way it has placed politics before policy, and adversaries before allies, and political legacy before leadership. The way it has confused weakness for restraint, concessions for compromise, and most simply of all, wrong for right. So to fully understand what we're dealing with in regards to Iran and Cuba, we have to understand who we are dealing with. In Iran, we are facing a radical Shia cleric who wish to one day unite the world under Islam, their version of Islam, and believe that it will only happen after a cataclysmic showdown with the West. Leaders who have been directly responsible for the death of hundreds of Americans in the last decade, who continue to lead chants of death to America every week, and who refuse to stop financing terrorists that seek to kill Americans and to wipe Israel off the map. In Cuba, we face a proudly anti-American leadership who continues to work with nations like Russia and China to spy on our people and our government, who harbor fugitives from American justice, and who stand in opposition to nearly every value our nation holds dear, by violating the basic human rights of their own people, by preventing democratic elections, and by depriving their nation's economy of freedom and opportunity. The world has missed having an American president who speaks honestly about the world in which we live. In the eyes of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, his former Secretary of State, the Cuban people are suffering because not enough American tourists visit that country, when in truth, the Cuban people are suffering because they live under a tyrannical dictatorship. It is ironic that the same president who visited a U.S. prison to talk about inequities in our own criminal justice system is silent about the fact that minor offenses in Iran and Cuba are punishable by indefinite detention, torture, or even death, and that these offenses often include nothing more than speaking out with the wrong political opinion. Instead of focusing his criticism on these illegitimate governments, the president has chosen to attack opponents of his policies here at home, going so far as to demonize critics of the Iran policy as, quote, lobbyists with money and warmongers. And he has criticized those who oppose to his Cuba policy as, quote, practitioners of ethnic politics. This is shameful, derogatory rhetoric, and it should have no place in our democracy, especially from our president. Centuries of global affairs tell us that the best way to affect an outcome with volatile leaders is through strength and through example, while the worst is through weakness and concession. Yet weakness and concession are the preferred tools of statecraft of this administration. President Obama has not only permitted Iran to retain its entire existing nuclear infrastructure, he has also endorsed the construction of a full-scale, industrial-size nuclear program within 15 years. He has conceded a vast enrichment capacity, preserved Iran's fortified underground facility, and failed to secure anytime, anywhere inspections. He has virtually guaranteed Iran becomes a regional power with the ability to build long-range missiles capable of hitting the United States homeland. And on top of all this, he wants to hand Iran $100 billion in sanctions relief, which will be used, in part, to fund Hamas and Hezbollah, promote instability in Bahrain and Yemen, and to prop up Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He has given all this away without any commitment that Iran will end its support for terrorism, accept Israel's right to exist, or return a single American hostage. In short, the deal with Iran isn't a deal at all. It's a string of concessions to a sworn adversary of the United States. And the negotiations with Cuba have proven equally one-sided. President Obama has rewarded the Castro regime for its repressive tactics and its persistent, patient opposition to American interests. He has unilaterally given up on a half-century worth of policies towards the Castro regime that was agreed upon by presidents of both parties. He has ensured the regime will receive international legitimacy and a substantial economic boost to benefit its repression of the Cuban people, which has only increased since the new policy was announced. And as a symbol of just how backward this policy shift has turned out to be, not a single Cuban dissident has been invited to today's official flag-raising ceremony at the new U.S. Embassy in Havana. Cuban dissidents have fought for decades for the very democratic principles President Obama claims to be advancing through these concessions. Their exclusion from this event has ensured it will be little more than a propaganda rally for the Castro regime. So I will make this pledge here and now. As president, as a symbol of our solidarity between my administration and those who strive for freedom around the world, I will invite Cuban dissidents, Iranian dissidents, Chinese dissidents, and freedom fighters from all around the world to be honored guests at my inauguration. Our current president has made no such effort to stand on the side of freedom. He has been quick to deal with the oppressors, but slow to deal with the oppressed, and his excuses are paper thin. He has made the argument that if the embargo hasn't worked for 50 years, why shouldn't we try something new? My question is, why hasn't he made a similar argument to the Castro regime? For over 50 years, they have tried tyranny and communism, and it hasn't worked either. The Cuban people have a standard of living well below that of virtually every other nation in the hemisphere. He's also made the claim that the people of Cuba do not have access to 21st century technology because of the U.S. embargo. This is patently false. They don't have access because the Castro regime has made this technology illegal. The notion that the Cuban people will be allowed freedom of speech and freedom of information now that President Obama has made concessions to the very government denying them these rights is complete fiction. The concessions to Iran and to Cuba both endanger our nation. And here's how. Here's how. The deal with Cuba threatens America's moral standing in our hemisphere and around the world. It brings legitimacy to a state sponsor of terror and further empowers an ally of China and Russia that sits just 90 miles from our shores. And if the effort to stop the Iran deal in the Senate fails, the threat posed will truly be historic. A nuclear arms race will likely overtake the Middle East, and the national security stakes of the election before us will become higher than those of any election since the end of the Cold War. It is important to note that Hillary Clinton not only supports these two deals, she now brags about her instrumental role in bringing them to fruition. The fact of the matter is, Hillary Clinton will not overturn these deals as president. I will. Beginning on day one, I will undertake a three-part plan to roll back President Obama's deal with Iran and repair the damage done to America's standing in the Middle East. First, I will quickly reimpose sanctions on Iran. I will give the mullahs a choice. Either you have an economy or you have a nuclear enrichment program, but you cannot have both. And I will also ask Congress to pass crushing new measures that target human rights abusers and Iran's leaders involved in financing and overseeing Iran's sponsorship of terrorism. Second, I will ensure our forces in the Middle East are positioned to signal readiness and restore a credible military option. This will be bolstered by my administration's efforts to rebuild our military by ending defense sequestration once and for all. And third, after imposing crippling sanctions on Iran, I will link any talks to Iran's broader conduct, from human rights abuses to support for terrorism and threats against Israel. I will insist that a deal must terminate Iran's nuclear program, Iran will never be allowed to build a nuclear weapon if I become president. Not now and not decades from now. That would be my policy for Iran. There would be no room for equivocation, no room for manipulation, and no room for cheating. Some would say, well, there will be no room for negotiations. But history proves otherwise. Iran may not return to the table immediately, but it will return when its national interests require it to do so. I will also undertake an equally bold plan to roll back President Obama's concessions to the Castro regime. First, thank you very much. First, on day one, I will give the Castros a choice. Either continue repressing your people and lose the diplomatic relations and benefits provided by President Obama, or begin to carry out meaningful political and human rights reforms and receive increased U.S. trade, investment, and support. Second, I will restore Cuba to the state sponsor of terror list until it stops supporting designated foreign terrorist organizations, helping North Korea evade international sanctions, or harboring fugitives from American justice. And third, I will do everything in our power to provide support, both direct and moral, to Cuba's pro-democracy movement, promote greater access to uncensored information for the Cuban people, and deprive the Castro regime of the funding for its repressive security state. These are the actions required to restore the safety and security President Obama has cost us through his diplomacy with dictators. When it comes to the challenges posed by Iran and Cuba, our task is straightforward. We must prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon, and we must guarantee that the United States stands on the side of the Cuban people, not the side of their oppressors. But we also know that the straightforward is not a synonym for easy. Confronting these challenges and the many other crises we face around the world will require what has always been required: leadership, principled leadership, based on strategy and security, not politics or legacy. And that's what I intend to offer our nation and the world in the years ahead. So thank you for having me today, and I look forward to answering your questions. Am I sitting here?
I'm the mother and grandmother of 5, so I'm going to take the liberty of giving Senator Rubio his water for breakfast. Yes. Thank you. Now the hard part. You know, you have talked very eloquently about what you would do now to stop President Obama's relationship with Cuba. But let's fast forward when you are President of the United States, if you are President of the United States. We've already established relations. The American flag is flying over Havana. And you have said just now you would roll back the relationship. But how realistic is that? I mean, if by 18 months from now, the United States will have business interests in Cuba, we will have contracts, major American companies will have already started building hotels, will have started tourist trades, will have started investment in industrial investment. So how do you undo all that?
Well, I actually don't think that is what's going to happen. First of all, when people have to understand there is no such thing as the Cuban economy. When we talk about an economy, we think of our own economy or some other economy. There is no such thing as the Cuban economy. What there is a massive holding company. It's called GAESA, G-A-E-S-A, and it's run by the Cuban military. They own everything in Cuba. All of the hotels, the telecommunications, the rent-a-cars, the gas stations, every major industry in Cuba is owned or operated by a company held within this larger company called GAESA. That's what when you open up to the Cuban economy, who you're opening up to is this holding company run by in fact, run by Raul Castro's son-in-law. So what American companies are going to find when they go to Cuba is, number one, a government that's going to say, well, we'll let you flag a hotel under your name, but it belongs to us, the workers work for us. You have no real ownership stake other than you may give you 20%, but we're the majority owner in everything. And there is no property rights or contracts that can be enforced anywhere. And so I don't think it's going to be as quick as people think. I think the initial bump is going to be travel, remittances are going to continue, obviously. You'll see some minor investments, but not major investments. The second point that I would make is I'm in favor of any policy that helps bring about change in Cuba. I would tell you today that if what the president had done had been in exchange for concrete promises by the Cuban government, we are going to begin to do this, we're going to begin to do that, I'd still be uncomfortable with elements of the deal, but it would be harder to argue against. Understand this arrangement. This arrangement is simply this. We're going to do all these things with Cuba. We're going to open up all these things that we are willing to do with Cuba. And Cuba responds, thank you very much, but we still want you to pay reparations, and we're not going to change a single thing. And they've said that repeatedly to their own people, and they've carried out. This Sunday, they rounded up, arrested, and beat over 90 dissidents, some of them wearing Barack Obama masks as they were parading down the street in protest. And so my point is, if they want to continue down this path, there better be some action on the part of the Cuban government, or we're not going to have an American flag flying over what a so-called embassy that in fact is nothing more than the same facility we had once there, but now we've given them this diplomatic recognition and legitimacy to an illegitimate government.
All right, so let's ask the tougher question from the United States perspective. The only time we've ever come close to having a nuclear war was over the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Soviet Union trying to put nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles in Cuba. How are you going to prevent the Chinese, who are interested in the region, the Iranians, who have also expressed interest in the region, and the Russians from doing some kind of military relationship with the Castro government and potentially using those ports as ports that they would put their own military naval vessels in?
Well, let me just tell you, I don't retreat from the doctrine that we will not allow any foreign power to establish in the Western Hemisphere an offensive military capability that's capable of attacking the United States. It's simple as that. Even
though Secretary Kerry himself has said the Monroe Doctrine is dead.
Well, Secretary Kerry's not going to be my Secretary of State, so. That's not going to happen, first of all. Second of all, the real threat posed by Cuba is twofold. Number one, on the island of Cuba, there are at least 2 signals intelligence facilities, one from the Russians and one from the Chinese, that actively collect against the United States. They particularly target Southern Command, Central Command, and NASA, all located in Florida. Second, Cuba harbors dozens of fugitives of American justice, including the killer of a police officer from New Jersey, including dozens of people indicted or accused of Medicare fraud, basically people that stole your money and are now living off of it in Cuba. There are also 2 Cuban generals or high military officials that were indicted for the murder of unarmed civilian Americans over international airspace back in 1996. And so these are the sorts of things that we need to point to as the threat that Cuba poses. And people forget this. Cuba was caught last year helping North Korea evade UN sanctions. They were caught doing it, and there was no punishment for it, nothing whatsoever. It's been lost, it's been forgotten. These are the kinds of threats that Cuba legitimately faces. Cuba's not a legitimate military threat in that way, unless, of course, they ramp up spending in that direction, and they don't have that capability. But they do have the capability of acting as a base of operations for others to target us, whether it's an intelligence or, in the case of the Russians, increased naval visits from an expanded Russian presence in the Western Hemisphere.
Can you, for the final question on Cuba, talk about, you said you would support a pro-democracy movement. I'm assuming that means covert activities. How would you do that?
Now, well, first of all, let me say that today I would work quickly to transition Radio and TV Marti, the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. Today it is largely a content provider. And we would remain functions of that, but I want it to become more of an access provider. So, for example, there now exists the capability of providing, through satellite technology, access to the internet. I believe if the Cuban people have had unfettered access to the internet, even if it's through a satellite capability, it would allow them to not just join social media and download Candy Crush, it would also allow them to communicate with one another and receive news from around the world. The blackout that exists in Cuba, the news blockade that exists in Cuba by the Cuban government is extraordinary. They will have no idea that this happened here today. They will have no idea about the debate going on in America. They don't get CNN or Fox News, or they don't get MSNBC either. But, well,
no loss.
Yeah, that's their loss, right? But they also don't. But all the information they get in Cuba is from Cuban government sources. And so I think breaking that news blockade will be a big part of helping that government transition, and we would pursue that quickly. And as far as the pro-democracy movement in Cuba, we have democracy programs now. We would continue to fund those and try to give them a stronger standing within the island. In essence, show that we are firmly on the side of those on civil society that are looking for a positive change. Because you're also looking to empower the next generation of Cuban leadership, people capable of functioning in a democratic society, even when that day comes, as we hope it will soon.
Let's move to Iran, and I want to go in two tracks. One, let's assume that, as you have predicted, that the president vetoes your bill to not have the Iran deal go through, and then it is not overridden, so that the president's Iran deal does go through. You've said when you're president you're going to unwind a lot of that. Let me ask the same kind of question about Iran as I did about Cuba. Twofold. One, the other countries in the world and the other countries who are signatories to the Iran deal, they don't care about that. They see an economic opportunity that they're not going to walk away from. The Europeans want to sell them cars, the Russians want to sell them weapons, the Chinese want to buy their oil. How effective would U.S. sanctions be in a Rubio administration?
Well, let's take out the Chinese and the Russians, because they've never cooperated to begin with. And they're not cooperating now. Soleimani was just parading up and down the streets of Moscow. Basically anything we're for, Vladimir Putin has decided he's against. And the Chinese have their own agenda, and they pursue it in their own way. They've never really been a critical linchpin of our efforts. They're at the negotiating table, but they never really cared or been as supportive about this as we want them to be, or as they should be, but don't realize they need to be. The other countries, I don't agree. Basically, when our sanctions are reimposed, for example, the banking sector in Germany, they're going to have a choice. They can have access to the U.S. economy, through which 50% of global capital flows happen, or they can choose to have access to the Iranian economy, through which less than 1% of global capital flows go through. I think they're going to choose the U.S. economy. When given a choice between having access to the American economy or the Iranian economy, these companies are going to choose the American economy. The second point that I would make about Iran is we don't have to think hard to imagine what's going to be in place in about 10 years. Just look at North Korea today. North Korea today possesses multiple nuclear warheads and long-range rockets capable perhaps of even reaching the continental United States. The good news is they're not very good at aiming. So we don't know if they're going to hit San Francisco or San Diego. The bad news is they could hit something. And so what does that mean? We don't have a credible threat of force against North Korea's nuclear program. Because if we were to target their nuclear program, the cost of it will be an attack on Seoul or on Tokyo or on Guam or on Hawaii or potentially on the west coast of the U.S. Well, that's what we're going to be in about 10 years with Iran. We will not have a credible threat of force against Iran because they will have rapidly already expanded their conventional capabilities, but we will also know that any sort of military action against Iran's nuclear program would result in an attack on Paris or London or Washington or New York. And that's where I know we will be in 10 years because of this deal.
What if we're there in a year and a half? What if Iran is a threshold nuclear state within a year and a half?
Well, again, I think that's why it's important. The only approach to Iran that has any chance of success in the short or long term is the combination of two things. Crippling sanctions on their economy and on individuals, which is what, quite frankly, forced them to the negotiating table to begin with, despite the fact that this administration fought against those sanctions. Though they go around now saying we put these sanctions in place and forced Iran to the table, the Obama administration was against and argued against these sanctions, using the same arguments they're using now. Sanctions combined with a credible threat of military force. Basically, as long as you're enriching uranium or reprocessing plutonium, sanctions will remain in place. And if you try to move towards a weapon, we will hit your facilities with a credible threat of military force. That's the only way that in the short to midterm we can really rein in this program. It's the only thing that has a chance of success.
When you say the Russians and Chinese have never been with us on the sanctions anyway, how do you prevent the Russians and the Chinese from establishing a much closer relationship with Iran, especially if we're not in the deal? If they can't buy American weapons, European weapons, they want to buy Russian weapons.
Well, we can't prevent, per se, from them from pursuing this route. It's a fact of what we face now. I think it's an eye-opener. But you know what? That actually answers my question. We've put a tremendous amount of stake in the United Nations Security Council, in which both of these countries have a veto power in. And so we're putting our faith in the enforcement of this mechanism, and two of the main countries involved in this endeavor have the sort of relationship that you've outlined. I still think, and I believe, that ultimately Iran's economy is impacted by U.S. sanctions in ways that the Russians cannot overcome. In fact, the Russian economy itself is the subject of sanctions now. So you would have two sanctioned countries interacting with one another, but neither one having access to the modern developed economies of the world. Look, it isn't going to prevent them from being able to do any commerce, but it's going to have a significant impact on their ability to grow their economy and therefore fund the operations that they're seeking to fund.
I want to turn to ISIS before we go to audience questions. You've talked about a joint Arab force, and that would be the way to fight ISIS.
A joint Sunni force,
Arab
right.
force, but it hasn't materialized.
No, it hasn't, and it requires American leadership to convene it. I think there's a willingness on the part of many of these countries to participate in this effort, and the elements of it would be nation states like Egypt and Jordan and many of the Gulf kingdoms, but it would also Saudi Arabia. But it would also involve empowering local forces in Iraq, the Sunni tribes themselves, to help defeat a radical Sunni movement. Obviously, it involves Kurds as well. And I think it also involves Christian communities who are asking for the ability to defend themselves, at least, from these attacks that they've experienced. So it's a combination of all these things. It would require U.S. leadership to help convene it and bring it together, and it will require some U.S. involvement. For example, technical, logistical, and intelligence support. Embedding special operations forces to help with targeting and training and strategic advice and so forth. But I do think ultimately this is not just because we don't want to be in the fight directly. It is also because I believe that the fastest and most enduring way to defeat a radical Sunni movement is for Sunnis themselves to defeat it, Sunnis themselves to reject it. It has to happen that way. Otherwise, the elements that made it possible are still in place. The resentment between Sunnis and Shia remain in place, which is one of the reasons why ISIS was greeted as a liberator initially. They were, when they re-entered Iraq. They were greeted as liberators from the Shia government in Baghdad, as that was the view of many of the Sunni communities. Obviously, they don't feel that way anymore because they now see the reality of this group. So I think it's critical that Sunnis play a linchpin role in defeating this radical Sunni movement.
So I take it from that then that you would not have cooperation with the Shiite militias that are active.
The problem with the Shiite militias is they're basically extensions of the Iranian government. They are nothing, they are part of this web of surrogates used by Iran to spread their influence in the world. And the Shia militia are involved not simply for the purposes of defeating ISIS, they're involved also for the purposes of increasing Iran's influence and leverage on Iraq. They want to become the dominant power in Iraq, and the Shia militias are part of that effort. In fact, they've supplanted the regular Iraqi army in many instances in that regard.
One of the audience questions is, you previewed it, the Middle East Christians. You know, the birthplace of Christianity, we're seeing the genocide of Christians. The Obama administration seems to not put that front and center on its foreign policy. How would you change?
Well, first of all, I think it is critical to talk about it. I mean, not enough has been said outside of groups like this about what's happening. You know, if this was the ritual slaughter of thousands of people of any other denomination, I think there would be an outrage in the world. For whatever reason, it hasn't led to the same level of outrage that's necessary. People driven from ancestral homelands, or for the first time in 2,000 years, there aren't masses being celebrated or Christian services on Sunday. And it's important that these communities be empowered. So obviously they need assistance in the short term. They're displaced in a bunch of different places. But I also believe they need the ability to defend themselves. If you talk to many of these communities, what they will argue is, we have no capability of defending ourselves. We are at the mercy of Kurds, or we are at the mercy of Sunni tribes. We are at the mercy of others. We count on others to provide for our defense. And obviously the Iraqi government is not a huge fan of this notion that we're going to be arming different elements in the region. But in the case of the Christians, they deserve the right to self-defense. And so I do believe that that is a key part of it. And ultimately, you know, I think they deserve the right to return to their historic, for example, in Iraq, the historic cities that have hosted them for thousands of years. And it should be part of any effort once we defeat ISIS, is to ensure that any successor government in Iraq is one that respects this pluralistic society where Christians and Kurds and Sunnis and Shias can all live side by side in some level with a unity government that ensures that. That's got to be part of our long-term strategic plans for the region. Otherwise, it won't succeed. We're going to be right back here again in 3 or 4 years.
You know, when you talked about Iran, you're going to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons, and you talked about North Korea, and it's the whole notion of nuclear proliferation. If Iran is a threshold nuclear state, other countries in the region have said, well, they will too. So what do you do as president when you are faced with the Middle East, where a number of countries are, I want what Iran has, threshold nuclear states?
Well, you prevent Iran from having it. I mean, that's the best way to prevent it from happening. Otherwise, it's exactly what you're going to face. It's a cascade. And imagine, put yourself in their position. Put yourself in the position of the Saudis for a moment, who will argue, and I have quarrels with many of the policies of the Saudi government, both domestically and around the world, but put yourself in their position. They view themselves as allies of the United States. They also view themselves as a strategic ally of the United States, and they also view themselves as a nation. They view themselves as a nation in conflict with the ambitions of a Persian Shia government in Tehran that wants to become the regional power. And they see themselves being encircled now, for example, with the activities going on in Yemen and in Bahrain, sponsored by Iran. So here they now turn, they look at their ally, the United States, and the United States is cutting a deal with Saudi Arabia's rival in the region. And that deal ensures that they're going to have an industrial capacity nuclear program. They're going to continue to develop long-range rockets. And the Saudis are saying to themselves, I know we live in this neighborhood. We know who you're dealing with. We know what these guys are going to do eventually. They're going to break out towards a weapon. And then they say, I promise you, if there is a Shia bomb, there will be a Sunni bomb. And so I think we can anticipate that Saudi Arabia has already taken steps, or will soon begin to take steps to be able to match anything Iran has. In essence, I am confident of this. If in 15 years Iran possesses, or 10 years, a nuclear weapons capability, they will not be alone in the region. At least Saudi Arabia will have the same capability, and you will have a situation analogous to what you see today between India and Pakistan, except in a much more unstable part of the world, where you could have as many as 3 or 4 nuclear-armed nations in the most unstable region on the planet.
You've talked about one of the first things you would do is increase defense spending, stop sequestration. How would you deal with missile defense?
Well, I think missile defense is a critical component of it, because one of the technologies that the threshold has dropped incredibly in terms of being able to access is intercontinental missiles. Nuclear weapons are still difficult to build because you need to have the enrichment capability, although the designs are widely available. You could, if you want to do it, even a poor country can. I mean, North Korea basically has no economy. It's a nation governed by a criminal syndicate, and yet it is capable of producing nuclear weapons. But the missiles are even easier to acquire. And nations like North Korea are proliferating that technology to anyone who's willing to pay for it. So you could easily foresee a situation in the next 10 or 15 years where 12 to 15 countries possess intercontinental missile capabilities with or without a nuclear warhead. They could also include electromagnetic weapons or all sorts of other potential threats. And so I think missile defense becomes a critical part of our notion, both in Europe, but also in the east and west coast of the United States. And it does require a significant investment. And you know, the Gates Commission that looked at all of this and set the baseline funding level that we should be at, but are not, anticipated all of these threats in their budget decisions. But again, that's why I believe that we must return to that baseline number. And here's my argument. The number one obligation of the federal government is to provide for our national security. There's a lot of other things the federal government wants to do. There are a lot of other things the federal government wants to do or has decided to do, but national security is the one thing the federal government must do. And so my view of budgeting is this: before you pay for anything else, you fully fund defense. And then you pay for everything else with the money that remains. And we're not doing that right now. We're treating it the same as every other program, and it's not.
Israel, longtime United States ally, but facing an even more dangerous neighborhood. I was on the Golan Heights recently, and I saw the ISIS flag flying. There's Hamas, there's Hezbollah, now even the Sinai has become a hotbed of radical extremists. How would you repair the relationship with Israel if you were president?
Well, by the way, you mentioned the Sinai. The Sinai is being destabilized by ISIS operating out of Libya. They're using that as a base of operation, both to target the Sinai, but I predict eventually Europe. Because from the Libyan port cities, you're just across the Mediterranean and right into Europe, and it's a great transit point for that sort of activity. And by the way, don't take your eyes off of ISIS in Afghanistan. There is a lot of instability now in the Taliban, and ISIS is beginning to try to fill that void. The question of Israel is, I think this is the most significant erosion in our relationship that we've seen since the founding of the Jewish state. Because this administration, what does Israel ask of the United States? Basically 2 primary things. It hasn't asked for our soldiers to fight for them. It hasn't asked us to conduct military operations in their place. It's asked for 2 things. Number 1, that we support them in international forums, that we use our veto power at the Security Council to prevent international sanctions or actions against Israel. And the second thing they ask for is that they run out of weapons, bullets, or rockets, that we rearm and supply them. For the first time in a long time, maybe ever, there are significant doubts in Jerusalem about both of these things. The Obama administration has telegraphed a threat that they may not use our veto power to prevent, for example, a recognition of a Palestinian Authority or the condemnation of Israel. And in fact, are intimating that if Israel does anything against Iran now, they will be an international pariah, and the U.S. won't be there to support them. And we saw just a year and a half ago when Israel came under attack and required some resupply, that the administration hesitated for a significant period of time because they were concerned about the way Israel was conducting its operations. So I think that's eroded the relationship significantly. If I'm president of the United States, the Israelis won't have to worry about either one. It will be crystal clear to the world that the United States of America will do whatever it takes to ensure that the only pro-American free enterprise democracy in the Middle East, the state of Israel, survives and prospers as a Jewish state.
We have several audience questions about China. Given Chinese territorial expansion in the South China Sea, how would you deal with our maritime presence in the region and China's expansion?
Well, it goes back to defense spending. First, we have to have the capability. Unfortunately, for about 3 to 4 months out of the year, we don't have an aircraft carrier presence in the Pacific region. And I, in fact, saw it myself when I was there in January, February of a couple years ago. All of our aircraft carrier for the region was in port and service, and so we didn't have a carrier presence. So it goes back to having the capability. I agree with a pivot to Asia, but you have to have something to pivot with. And while the administration's taken some positive steps, for example, the Marines' presence in Australia and some of the other measures that have occurred, I think we need to have a greater capability in the region. I also am encouraged, and we should continue to encourage the Japanese willing to do more. Abe has looked for ways, has found some creative lawyers that have allowed them the opportunity to now provide for collective self-defense. And that's important because the Japanese military or self-defense forces are quite capable. They are an incredible force multiplier for us. They use our weapons systems. They're very good at missile defense, and they're a critical part of our effort in that region as well. And the third is simply not accepting it. We do not accept these artificial islands and the claims that China makes around them, and we need to challenge them. We need to continue to send ships through the South China Sea without asking for permission. We shouldn't in any way admit these exclusive air zones that China is claiming, but we should continue to challenge them repeatedly and ensure that we have the presence and in the region to be able to back that up. And by the way, when we talk about the capability to be in the region, understand China doesn't want a direct war with the U.S. What they want to do is create conditions where we have to accept reality in their minds. And here's why they're doing it. They are investing in anti-access asymmetrical capabilities. In essence, they're not going to build 12 aircraft carriers. They're going to build a lot of cheaper rockets that can destroy expensive aircraft carriers. And once they can do that, they know it forces our fleet further and further away from the area of operation. And then they can turn to the countries in the region and say, you know, you've got this American security agreement that you're relying on, but they can't really live up to it anymore. So you might as well fold in under the order that we've created. In essence, it's almost like a reverse Monroe Doctrine. It is the Chinese version of the Monroe Doctrine in the Asia-Pacific region, that they must be the dominant military and political power in the region, and we can't be around. We shouldn't accept it. We are a Pacific power with deep interests and relationships in that region. Our economy is deeply dependent on our access to the Asia-Pacific region, and in no way should we cede ground on that to China or any nation.
The countries you've identified as presenting real threats to the United States, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they all have one thing in common, which you alluded to, that they don't let their people have access to the World Wide Web. They don't let their people have access to social media. What proactive foreign policy initiatives would you take to tear down those cyber walls?
Well, first of all, the point you make is an excellent one. It's one I've been making increasingly over the last 2 weeks. Look all over the world. All the problems on this planet are being created by totalitarian states or totalitarian movements. In essence, there aren't a lot of there's not a single free enterprise democracy on the planet threatening people, creating instability, violating the rules of international engagement. All the problems are being created by tyrants. And so in some ways, while the world has rapidly changed, there's fundamental truths that are always there, and that is the battle between liberty and freedom and tyranny and oppression. Now, what we can do about it? Well, look, I think we need to firmly be on the side of those that are looking to change these societies. So if I'm president and there's a green revolution in Iran, my first statement isn't going to be, I'm not going to interfere in the sovereignty of Iran. My first statement's going to be, we stand with in solidarity and in support of those in the streets of Tehran who are protesting against that. It's why we pursued and I helped pass sanctions against human rights violators in Venezuela. It's why we've talked about the democracy programs in Cuba today. It's why we need to be firmly on the side of those seeking political change in China, in Russia, in Iran, everywhere in the world where tyranny is being confronted by brave people that are standing up for it. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, this administration has looked the other way on human rights, on pro-democracy movements, and things of this nature. And when you do that, you demoralize these movements. The moral authority and power of the United States should not be underestimated. It is clearly a key role in providing both moral sustenance but also international attention to those that sought freedom and opportunity in the world during the Cold War. We can play the same role now. The last question you asked is, how do we break the cyber blockade? Well, that's a little harder in large countries like Russia and China, but I can tell you how we don't allow it to accelerate, and that is by turning the internet over to a world government organization of some sort that now regulates the internet and actually finds that these practices are legitimate.
You've often been compared with your optimism about America's future, while the rest of the country and mainstream media and a lot of polls have said that Americans, great majority of Americans, think that the future is going to be less good than the past has been, that they look ahead and they say we're a nation in decline. You have talked a number of times about restoring America's leadership role in the world, but also America's sense of itself and confidence in its own moral, the shining city on the hill, to borrow Ronald Reagan's phrase. How would you go about doing that?
Well, first of all, I'm optimistic about America because despite our challenges, I wake up every morning with a belief that I wouldn't trade places with any other country in the world. In essence, I encourage everyone here to ask yourself the same question. Despite our challenges, who would you rather be? Would you trade places with Russia? Would you trade places with China? I don't think anybody in this room would, and neither would I. We have challenges and they need to be confronted. That's not new. Every generation has faced challenges. Some were domestic, some were international, some were both, but we've always faced great challenge, and we always will. And the question for us is not whether we face challenges, it's whether we're going to solve them and move on. I actually think the 21st century holds extraordinary promise. For example, economically, we now live in a world where there are hundreds of millions of people that can afford to buy the things we make, the services we offer, who are prepared to invest with us and partner with us. We've never had a global economy with so many people who buy things and invest in things. And we can be a big winner, as can they. It's not a zero-sum game. I'm very optimistic about that. I'm optimistic about the fact that all over the world, a growing number of people aspire to liberty and freedom. And in many respects, while the internet poses challenges, for example, the ability to radicalize Americans, it also poses extraordinary opportunity, which is the ability to collaborate and spread news and information quicker than ever. These are positive developments. Our choice is, do we harness them and lead, or are we overwhelmed by them and are left behind? Americans are insecure about tomorrow because the world is rapidly changing. Our economy is not undergoing a downturn. It is undergoing a massive transformation. It is like the Industrial Revolution happening every 5 years. And the question we must answer is, are we going to embrace it, or do we ignore it, fight against it, and get left behind? And geopolitically, yes, the world is changing, but it still requires American leadership. In the absence of our leadership, what you leave behind is a vacuum, and that vacuum leads to chaos. America's never asked for this job of being the global leader. But for some reason that we don't fully understand, fate has given it to us. And now we have a choice. We must either accept it, or the world will become a darker, more difficult place to live in. Because as I said, in the absence of our leadership, there's no one that takes our place, and the chaos that follows makes the world more dangerous and less prosperous.
With that inspirational closing, I think we should let Senator Rubio get on with the rest of his day, because he has a hard out and he's on the air in about 10 minutes across the street. Would everybody please stay standing? I know you want to get out, but please let Senator Rubio go out.
I'm going
and
to
mob
Fox.
him. Yeah, exactly. Fair and balanced. So, Senator Rubio, if you would leave, everybody stay seated, let the senator.
Thank you very much.
And then run back to your television. Thank you.
Hey, ask again that you please remain seated so the senator can make his way out. I just want to briefly wrap up today's event by thanking Senator Rubio again for sharing his time and his views with us. Thanking KT for moderating such a thoughtful conversation. And of course, thanking all of you for joining us this morning. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.